Welcome back. Hey, Paula.
Welcome back. How are you? Been a great week.
It has, and we've had lots more conversations about
Yeah,
risk.
absolutely. Well, sorry, I cut you off.
It's okay.
Yeah, I mean, last week when we ended it, we were just starting to talk about risk in the business, right? And we had talked about the risk. We were starting to talk about the risk that's lurking in your balance sheet,
Yeah.
and just assuming that all those healthy looking numbers aren't hiding anything, right? Which is really where we were going. Right? You've got a healthy balance sheet. Everything's great. Nothing to see here. We're not in politics. We're in business. So there's always something to see here. But yeah, I mean, there are a number of risks, I think, that when we're going into year-end planning, when we're going into scenario planning, are really critical to stop and take a look at in the business. And some of those are internal risk. Some of those are external risk. So let's start with the internal ones. What, because they're kind of easier to see in a business, but what are some of the big internal risks that you look at with your clients at the end of the year?
Well, one of the things we were talking about last time was really visibility. And
Yeah.
so, if you do not have visibility in the basic pieces of how the business machine operates, that's a problem.
Yeah.
I find in conversation with my clients, it's usually one of two things as well. There's a lot of conversation that says, I do this, I do that, I. And there's a
Hmm.
lot of conversation with larger teams that go, Bob does this, Bob does that, Bob. And in both cases, I lean back and I smile and I say, key man risk. You are relying
Yeah.
on one person. Now, look, if you're a solopreneur operation, that's okay to rely on one person and know it's a risk, and there's ways to mitigate it. If you're a small to medium sized team, you can also not rely on just one person. And all of that leads to, in my head, two different things. Those are processes, how well
Hmm.
documented are they? Talk about another risk. And automations, in this age that we have the pleasure of being able to say, well, there's a lot of different automations we could put in place.
Yeah.
And that will mitigate that if Bob or I wind up going down, uh, the business will still continue. The basics of it will still move forward until you can find that replacement for whatever you need to fill the gap.
Yeah. Big time. And it's funny because one of the pieces as a leader, right? When when you hear that, you think, I don't want to know everything about every step that Bob takes. I don't want to know how to cross the T's and dot the I's because I'll end up being the one doing it. I don't have time. There's no space left in my brain to hold all that information, right? But it brings back to me to one of and this is my bugbear. This is my bugbear with companies is pushing off the metrics,
Mm-hmm.
pushing off the metrics, right? You know what? My bookkeeping is up to date and I'm getting my financials. Yeah, that's critical. Not diminishing it. Keep that going. But that doesn't mean it's okay to not pay attention to your marketing metrics. That doesn't mean it's okay to not pay attention to your sales metrics. Doesn't mean you're not paying attention to some of your other production metrics, right? Because everything that lives in your finances, every piece of information that lives in your finances, there's nothing you can do about it because it's everything that happened in history. Your finances tell you what you're able to do right now, and they tell you what you did yesterday and how that worked out. They have no bearing on what's actually happening today that's going to create the financial report tomorrow.
We spend a lot of time, I've noticed, on this show talking about metrics.
Yep.
And it's really important to remember leading versus lagging, which is exactly
Oh,
what,
yeah.
right? Leading metrics, they are predictive of success or failure, whereas lagging metrics tell you about the past and the history. So the point that you were just making, right? They tell you
Yeah.
about the decisions you've already made and how they turned out. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't learn from those decisions going forward. Maybe I won't make the same decisions again, but it will show you where you have risk in the business. I often see clients who have risk in the business in their pipeline, their revenue. And that comes down to your expertise, right? Sales and marketing,
Yeah.
looking at that rev engine and going, how do I fix this? How do
Yeah.
I make it so that it's predictable and move forward? And I find for many of the owners, because they're thinking they're looking at these different areas, they're not prioritizing the one that they need to that kind of solves the biggest stress for everybody, which is revenue. If I can get the
Yeah.
revenue in and keep it and make the business profitable, then all the other things in my business I can think through properly, prioritize, and fix and make work the way I want them to.
Totally. It's I equate it to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? So, I mean, in business or in life, right, we have Maslow's hierarchy. If you've taken any psychology course in your life ever, you've heard of Mr. Maslow. But your business works the same way. If your business doesn't have revenue, if it doesn't have anything to eat, you can't actually worry about growth. You're so busy trying to survive today and tomorrow. The brain is so focused on getting through this month that envisioning next year or 5 years or 10 years is, a nice mental break from the stress of today. And I don't know that we pay enough attention when we start our business, when we're growing our business, to making sure that pipeline is healthy. But I can tell you, the clients I have that come to me and that's where they're focused are always in a better position than the clients I have that come to me and that hasn't been their focus. Their focus has been on building an exceptional product. Their focus has been on giving great service. Their focus has been on everything that happens after they acquire a client and very little on what happens before they acquire that client. And the difference in the business and its future prospects are night and day. You know, it's easier to have a healthy pipeline and solve operations problems than it is to have a healthy operation system and solve a pipeline problem, because the operation system is an overhead that you carry. They're the extra mouths to feed when you're not, you know, not bringing in the cash.
And I think very little, there's a lot written about it, but it's not really
Mm-hmm.
talked about enough
No.
with granularity for those people who have the successful small business and have decided to hit grow and scale. And then they're doing all the things the same way. And that's what makes it so
Yeah.
chaotic, right? And I'll just talk from my own experience here. When I went from being the solopreneur to bringing on the first part of the team, that actually went pretty well. Okay.
Yeah.
That was pretty simple. When I did that, and I was like, well, I'm still turning away clients, so that doesn't make sense. Maybe make the team bigger. The challenge that that brought in terms of lead generation and assuming, of course, and this is what I think we want to get to as well, assuming that my clients were experiencing some of the same challenges as they were 2 years ago,
Oh, yeah.
right? These different questions and conversations, we had to approach it very differently than when I was a solopreneur, than when I was a small team of four. And now I get into this bigger team, and you're like, oh, now I have all these mouths to feed. I better make sure that this is repeatable and I can hit the scale button and. And it didn't all work the exact same way with the same assumptions.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because when, the smaller your team is, the more you're selling personalities, right? If you have a small restaurant and people come to your restaurant, yes, they come for the food, but they also come for the people and the familiarity and that entire sort of ambiance in their local neighborhood. You turn that restaurant into a franchise with 30 locations. The reason people come to the restaurant changes, and the neighborhood you're in changes, and the needs of the customer change. And it's the same for every business. The more the organization grows, the less personal it becomes. And I'm going to be real with you. Some people make a choice. I'm going to stay small and real because that matters to me a lot. And I think that's a great choice. I think it's a perfectly okay choice. And we need to start normalizing, you know what, my 50-year vision, my 20-year vision is that my son or my daughter, or, my brother's kids or whatever, take this business over and it sustains our family. But I have no interest in being like a 5 location shop. That's fine. There's really no shame in that. And our hustle culture, we have a lot of, you must be growing. The number of times I was extolled, you need a bigger revenue goal. Why? I
Yeah.
don't actually. I don't. Not for the vision I had. No. Um, but it's knowing what that is, and then, like you said, let's take a look at our customers. I think there's another side to it, though. It's not just about the size of your business. Human beings are not static, right? Human beings change and evolve in response to what's happening in their personal lives, in response to what's happening in the economy, in response to what's happening in politics, in response to their health, in response to what's happening with the market of their industry. There are all these different external factors at play that, quite frankly, you've zero control over. Absolutely zero control. How many business owners were blindsided in February 2025?
A
How
large
many?
portion of them.
Right?
Yeah.
How many of them could have done anything to control the outcomes and the things that happened in the world that made February 2025 happen?
I know. Right? Small numbers.
Small, right? Very little influence. So wasting time worrying about it is wasting time worrying about it. But one of the things that I think a lot of people didn't do and really needed to was stop and take a look at how their customers were engaging. Right? I mean, we did some of this, you and I, and with another colleague of ours, we ran a series of roundtables
Yeah.
for businesses to get together and just talk about what was happening. And part of that was to be of service to our community, right? We wanted to help the businesses, here in where we live, that were struggling with the shifts in the economy and weren't prepared for them, and were scared and were worried. So part of it was that, but there was a component of that was also about understanding what was happening inside the psychology um, of the clients that we were serving. And yeah, you could talk to the person you're talking to one on one, but really getting that broader market. And I don't think often enough as companies we stop and just ask ourselves, what's no longer true today that was true when we did our buyer personas? What's changed in our client organizations that impacts their path to purchase? How is that changing? How is decision making changing? How is um, prioritization changing? And we've been through this twice now. In the last little while, we went through it in COVID, right? All of a sudden, yeah, the whole world shuts down. Like nobody was prepared for that puppy, except maybe a few people at the WHO. But really, nobody was prepared. That changed the way prioritization got done. Companies that would never, ever, ever allow someone to work from home. You had to be in the office where I could see you, so I can see that you're working, so that I have control over your environment. Suddenly found themselves incredibly open to Zoom meetings and remote work, right? Their needs changed. I was in Slack groups where people were talking about, how do we have a Christmas party when everybody's on a Zoom call? How do we have a disciplinary meeting when the person is working in their home and they have our equipment in their home? Like all of these how do we questions. If you were serving those companies, their needs changed. How many retailers became e-commerce shops like this, right? Shopify spiked by capitalizing on that, by making affordable programs and real support available for struggling retailers. Those retailers are still Shopify retailers today, right? It's really, you've got to know what's happening.
I've had along that line conversations with a couple of my clients, also around willingness to pay surveys.
Oh yes. Mm-hmm.
Because the economics, when we talk about affordability crises, when we talk about geography, whether it's a region, right? You and I are located in Canada, but we are not located in the same region of Canada.
Yep.
So the realities for shipping or affordability or different things really matter. And I also remember back in February and March having conversations with members of my team where it was the difference between the US and Canada. The words that I could use in during a sales process were now all of a sudden not the same. They were the same in December, they were the same in November,
Yeah.
but they were not the same in February. And so, what did I need to focus on in order to keep the lights on in the business and the overhead paid for and the fixed costs and the variable costs? And how do you look at willingness to pay when you're a retailer versus a service industry? How do you deal with Trump coming out one day and going, "Oh, I'm going to tax the 100% tariff on the film industry"? Like, how do
Yeah.
you do that one? I don't know how that works. I mean, steel or the truck going across the border, I get the logistics there. I don't get the logistics in some of these other pieces. And so it's these conversations I think need to be had as you do strategic planning going into
Yeah.
2026.
Yeah. What has changed? What is stable, right? And I mean, if we just keep it to our Canadian audience, what has changed? New trade routes,
Mm-hmm.
new trade relationships, potentially new markets. But as you say, those potentially new markets have logistics concerns. They have, um, how do we access the market? How do we communicate with the market? What are the labor laws in the local market? What are the trade laws in that market? So there's a lot of learning to be done there. To that, you have changes in the demand structure in your current market, both here at home and with our nearest trading partner. Demand has changed for lots of different products, lots of different services, um, and also then changes in the cost of doing business. And so you've got to look at all of those pieces, and those pieces are impacting your clients as much as they're impacting you,
Uh,
right? And
I, sorry.
I, I was just going to wrap my comment up with saying that if you've been going to market with a premium service, luxury messaging, the whole world has been dragged down that Maslow's hierarchy. It's no longer in the self actualization. And coming out of COVID, a lot of businesses were in self actualization for their business. They were big dreaming, they were looking to really expand and grow. For the most part, economies were relatively healthy globally. I mean, things were in pretty decent shape for an incredibly good 2025 for a lot of people. 2025 was going to be their year that they got to recover from COVID, and it was a very healthy environment. You have premium, right? Now, come April 2025, businesses have been dragged like falling off a ladder back down two or three rungs where they're fighting for survival. They're not sure that the pipeline is stable anymore. They're not sure. So when people aren't sure, they retrench. They don't spend on things they don't need. I keep coming back to retail because retail is a very obvious analogy, but it happens in business as well, right? So in retail, luxury goods, to a certain extent, started to feel the pinch soonest because the people with the most money to lose were the people who were being the most cautious up front, and there was a bit of a lag, but you did see that starting to retrench in the luxury good market. But you also saw trade shipping, right? Tariff uncertainty. You couldn't get stock. So now scarcity kicks in, and there's all these different dynamics. Same thing is happening in your business. And so your messaging might need to change. And I think a lot of, in consultants in particular, a lot of consultants got caught off guard. And I'm not claiming that I was prepped, right? I'm no smarter than anybody else. But a lot of consultants got caught off guard because instead of talking about a survival, this is something you have to do for survival. We were talking about this is something you do for the future. No, this is something you do to survive today, right? If you're not paying attention to your what's happening in your world, this is about your survival. This is no longer about your future. And in a lot of cases, I think a lot of businesses were in the same boat.
I think it's interesting because there's the second and third order effects, right? You have the disruption, whichever
Yep.
time period you're talking about, whether it be COVID, whether it be February of 25 and the first quarter of the year.
Yeah.
I had clients who, in the last quarter of the year, it wasn't so if I'm doing strategic planning, it's not my clients who had the risk, but their clients and their client base who became the risk, which then feeds through to me, right? Because it's my
Yeah.
clients were healthy, we're all good. 6 months later, we're not having the same conversations all of a sudden. Why aren't we? Well, because they're losing clients. And so these pieces, when you go
Yeah.
into strategic planning and we're talking about risk reduction, it's yes, who are my clients? But let's also take a look at the existing clientele, the existing pipeline, and say, who's their client? Is their client a risk to them that they haven't yet addressed that I need to be
I
mindful of because of who they serve?
yeah.
We are sadly at the end of time again.
We always get to like the really juicy piece and then but you know what? I think that brings up another topic, and maybe we can address it next week, which is those hidden things that are killing your cash flow and you don't see it coming because you just brought up a big one. So let's park that one. We'll come back next week on our little mini series on forecasting and getting ready for a strong 2026.
Are we going to talk about the money, honey?
We talk about the money, honey. Yes, we are.
Perfect. All right, everyone. Thank you for spending the time with us today.
Bye, everybody.